Hi everyone, and welcome to my video on does what happens in the pond stay in the pond from D.H. Lawrence's The Horse Dealer's Daughter. This is in response to our recent blog debate on whether Jack is truly in love with Mabel. And I felt that rather than responding to each of you individually on your blogs, I would just present to the class my sense of where the discussion went and how we might round it out, move it in a slightly different direction, and continue to engage. And so I found about, 75% of you were pretty adamant that Jack does not love Mabel, or if it is love, it's not real love. And so some examples are Michael's case that he loves her as an owner loves a dog. Caitlin made it pretty clear that it's pity or obligation, and that she is vulnerable both physically and mentally. We also have Cameron making the point that he could have just been treating her as he would any patient, trying to cure her, and Jamie making the point that, the last line of the story is that he answers blindly, and that there's a rushing and impulsiveness in this, and it's just too soon to tell. Also have Jose's point that he was under the weather, slightly intoxicated, and impressionable from the beginning, so perhaps not sufficiently mature or developed enough to be in love. So to summarize, I would say there's a line of thinking that she was desperate and forced him to say he loved her before he was ready to, or maybe even, regardless of whether he was ready or not. That what he felt was attraction, infatuation to be sure, but certainly not love. Also that he did what any good doctor would do, no more. He saved her life and he kept her safe after that. And there's also the line that it's just too soon to tell, that we can't make this sort of generalization or projection based on what we see in the story. I certainly do not dismiss any of these claims. I think that they are valid, but I would like to look at this question from a more text-specific way and look for the pivotal scene in the story that I think really brings us out. So I'm going to be looking at the scene building up to when he saves her in the pond, and maybe touching on when he saves her directly. To frame it, I will agree that he feels an attraction towards her in the two previous scenes, once when he sees her at her family's house before they all leave, and then again when she is at her mother's graveside in the cemetery. He is clearly drawn to her. They look at each other. No indication from her how she feels towards him, and no clear indication from him what it is he feels towards her. So now let's just look at D.H. Lawrence's first paragraph here. Below Old Meadow, in the green, shallow, sodden hollow of fields, lay a square, deep pond. Roving across the landscape, the doctor's quick eye detected a figure in black passing through the gate of the field, down towards the pond. He looked again. It would be Mabel Pervin. His mind suddenly became alive and attentive. So let's use the pen feature here and just play with it a little bit, so you have this idea of green, shallow, soddened hollow of fields lay a square, deep pond. Looking at that first sentence, what struck me, among other things, is the strong alliteration, shallow, sodden, as well as square. And then you have the repetition of shallow, hollow, so you have the rhyming pattern going on. And you have these images of very organic, the green fields, with very, in a way, artificial, the square, deep pond. Almost seems like it's man-made. I would say it's not a stretch to see it as like a grave. The square, deep pond in the ground at the bottom of these fields. And then you have, additionally, the combination of very, I would say, fluid images roving across the landscape, quick eye, figure passing through the gate. And then you also have, the notion of very alive and attentive. So there's a very kind of a fast maybe electric movement going on here, but then you have it begin below Old Meadow, very sort of stalling and saturated, sodden hollow fields, very kind of murky and slow and dense images. Let's look at some of the other ones. Why was she going down there? He pulled up on the path on the slope above and stood staring. He could just make sure of the small black figure moving in the hollow of the falling day. He seemed to see her in the midst of such obscurity that he was like a clairvoyant, seeing rather with the mind's eye than with ordinary sight. Yet he could see her positively enough whilst he kept his eye attentive. He felt if he looked away from her in the thick, ugly, falling dusk, he would lose her altogether. Okay, so again, we're going to pull out some ideas here of a small, sorry, I've got to make sure I get it right. Small black figure. And you also have this idea of thick, ugly, falling dusk. The idea of losing her. A hollow again, and a failing day. Then you have here kind of jumping down a little bit. This wonderful line, then he could see her no more in the dusk of the dead afternoon. Again, the alliteration and the clear death images, black figure moving deeper, motionless water. I think you all get it. Clearly, the symbolism here is that she has entered both literally, figuratively, the land of the dead, and he is watching it. He is a witness to this traumatic, overwhelming scene. And he hastened straight down, running over the wet, sodden fields, pushing through the hedges, down into the depression of callous, wintry obscurity. I love that line. I'm going to actually make a note of that too. Callous, wintry obscurity. I think I just missed it, so let me go back. There we go. Callous, wintry obscurity. He's breathing heavy. His eyes could not penetrate the dead water. Dark shadow, dead water, black clothing. Okay, so we definitely get all of that. And now this next line, I would argue, is pivotal. He slowly ventured into the pond. The bottom was deep, soft clay. He sank in. The water clasped dead cold round his legs. As he stirred, he could smell the cold, rotten clay that fouled up the water. It was objectionable to his lungs. Still repelled and yet not heeding, he moved deeper into the pond. The cold water rose over his thighs, over his loins, upon his abdomen. The lower part of his body was all sunk in the hideous cold element, and the bottom was so deeply soft and uncertain, he was afraid of pitching with his mouth underneath. He could not swim and was afraid. So what do you have here? You have him in a repetition of Mabel voluntarily going into the land of the dead, voluntarily going into the pond. But unlike Mabel, he is afraid. He cannot swim. He feels the water pulling him in, and I think that's some really interesting images of the clay and the bottom of this pond being very soft, being very cold, smelling very rotten, an overwhelming sensory explosion that's going on. He crouched a little, spreading his hands under the water and moving them round, trying to feel her. The dead, cold pond swayed upon his chest. And then finally we see, and so doing so, he lost his balance and went under, horribly suffocating in the foul, earthy water, struggling madly for a few moments. At last, after what seemed an eternity, he got his footing, rose again into the air, and looked around. He gasped, knew he was in the world. Then he looked at the water. She had risen near him. He grasped her clothing and, drawing her nearer, turned to take his way to land again. I'm going to just skip over this last part because I think I've probably gone long enough with the close reading, but let's look at some of the critical words and phrases. Green, shallow, sodden, hollow, square, deep, black, alive, ugly, falling, dusk, lose her altogether, dusk of the dead afternoon, callous, wintry obscurity, dead water, dark shadow, water clasped dead cold round his legs, cold rotten clay. He could not swim. He was afraid, staggered to the bank. So we get it. This is life and death. This is the land of the dead. where it takes you and doesn't give you back. This is where, if you want to think of it archetypally, this is the winter season. This is when things are cold and alone and at the end. But if you think of it in a slightly different metaphorical way, while death, with the grave images and the cloying clay and the drowning, certainly represents the descent that Mabel goes through, if you chart that to Jack, what you see is the rebirth images, that he goes into the water and comes back out. He goes into the water, we could argue, alone in this world, and comes back out with Mabel. I want to look at Jessica's statement about the baptism idea, in which she says, seems like a baptism for the two of them, as once they have both been completely immersed and then rise out of the water, they have transformed from two separate people to two people who now have to face their feelings for each other. Up until this scene, Mabel and Jack are pretty separate characters and only observe each other. Once they go through the pond experience, they are drawn together. If you think of a definition of baptism, to cleanse spiritually, initiate or dedicate by purifying, a trying or purifying experience or initiation, like a baptism by fire. Clearly, surviving the pond was a baptism insofar as it was a trying experience and initiation. And you can make an argument that it's a purifying, that it allowed him to see past a certain superficiality into some truth, penetrated the cloudy nature and saw some light. And etymology of the word baptism is to immerse from the Greek. So then I would pose as a question, well, what is love? If it is not something like he lost his balance and went under horribly, suffocating in the foul earthy water, struggling madly for a few minutes. At last, after what seemed an eternity, he got his footing, rose again into the air and looked around. He gasped. So it's the giving, this is clearly like going through the birth canal, the baby comes to life and gasps for air. To be vulnerable means to be woundable. To be woundable means to be exposed. To be in love means, I would argue, that you have allowed yourself to be vulnerable and woundable by another. And Jack, up until this point, had always had his armor on, always had been closed. And while on a literal level, he did save Mabel's life, I would argue, I think it's an argument worth exploring, that on a symbolic level, she saved his life as well. By bringing him out of this experience into a deeper connection with another human being, one that he had never had before, one that he did not willingly ask for, but I think the text leaves it wide open to say that it's one that only now is he ready to fully engage in. And now I'm going to try to turn off the video. Where are you, video?